Oh, thank you, Louise, and yeah, thank you everyone for coming out. I know everyone loves to come and listen to a live economist on a Tuesday night. It's quite a tradition here in Perth, I understand, so thanks for squeezing me in. And no, thank you, and to all the people who helped organise tonight, and for me particularly to Louise. I rang her a couple of weeks ago and said, I'd love to do a launch in Perth if I can you help? And that was it. I didn't do anything after that. Louise made all this happen. So thank you, Louise. Much appreciated. And yeah. And by made it all happen, I mean literally, you know, brought you guys together, which is of course what I write about in the essay. That's what a community is. Indeed, that's what politics is. It's the ability for people to unite around some form of common objective. It's not a new idea, but to some extent it's been, or to a large extent in Australian public life, it's been radically undermined by neoliberalism, which says you guys should have all organised this yourself. Well, that's really what neoliberalism says, is if you wanted this to happen, you should have done it as individuals. Because the whole idea of neoliberalism, the publicly argued one, is that we're better off leaving everyone to their own devices to solve their own problems. Why would we collectively solve a health problem or an education problem when we could leave it to individuals to sort that out for themselves? So I'll come back to that in my introductory comments tonight. But really, the fact that you're all here and the fact that getting here is as much a feat of will as it is of coordination, I think is a really important point to keep in mind when we think about what kind of country we want to live in. Because if we want to do more things together, it's not rocket science. We just actually have to do it. And not everyone wants to do it. That's okay, but you know, that's the thing about democracy. If most of us want to, we can usually do it. So let me start with the whole point of the essay. It's called Dead Right. Dead Right. How neoliberalism ate itself and what comes next. The right aren't quite dead. That's a bit of a misleading title. But the right's big idea for the last 30 years, neoliberalism, the idea of that small government, low taxes, free markets, deregulation, all that neoliberal agenda, what I argue in the essay is that's dead. It's gone. And it was killed by the right. It was killed by the right. Tony Abbott wants to nationalise power stations in Australia. That's fine. No, that's good. I want to nationalise some things. No, but hold that point. Yeah, he wants to nationalise the coal-fired power stations, but you're missing the point. He thinks that nationalising things is a good idea. Agree with the man. Sure, we can quibble over what we should nationalise, but in principle, Tony Abbott thinks that nationalising things is an appropriate and effective way to solve some problems. Matt Canavan, the Minister for Resources, wants to subsidise new coal mines. That's okay, that's great. He wants to subsidise new coal mines because he wants more coal mines. I want to subsidise more dental care because I see room for a lot more dental care. But Matt and I, we agree. We agree that subsidies are a really important government intervention. Did you get it? All right? I'm not making this up. Tony Abbott wants to nationalise stuff. Good. Matt Canavan wants to subsidise stuff. Good. Malcolm Turnbull wants to build Snowy 2.0. Right? He thinks that the public sector investing billions and billions of dollars in a particular energy storage solution is a great idea. I agree with him. I think he's picked the wrong one. But again, that would be missing the point. And of course, we're having a national debate at the moment about well, not really led by anyone, but private members bill at the moment from Susan Lee, Queensland Liberal, private members bill on restricting free trade. What is that bill? Live exports. See, that no one in Australia supports free trade anymore. Okay? Because if you're into free trade, you wouldn't be banning exports or something, would you? Right, so the right have abandoned neoliberalism. And this is really important to realise. And we can keep calling them names if we want to, but calling the right neoliberal is to flatter them unfairly. Because neoliberalism is an ideology. An ideology is not a dirty word. An ideology means a cohesive, systematic worldview, a framework. And the modern right in Australian politics doesn't have one of those. It doesn't have one, and that's okay. They're allowed to just kind of have a grab bag of random ideas. But when we call them ideologues, when we call them neoliberals, when we say they're obsessed with the economy, we're flattering them unfairly. All right? They don't deserve to be called ideologues, because that would suggest they had principles. No, I mean it. I can respect an ideology. I can respect people who stick to their principles, but they want to shovel public money onto their friends, and they want to cut public money from their enemies. That's not a principle. That's not an ideology. That's just good old-fashioned politics. And what neoliberalism has done for 30 years is act as a cloak to conceal that raw politics from the broader public. Oh, I don't want to cut spending on health and education. I have to. Why? Oh, because of the budget deficit. Oh, what about your fucking tax cuts? Oh, they're different. See, good, you're laughing, right? But don't laugh at me, laugh at them. Right, because this has worked for them for decades. It's not that I hate health workers or teachers. It's that I'm worried about the budget deficit. Right, well, that's been a convenient lie, which their current determination to cut $200 billion worth of revenue makes a bigger lie of. The people that said we had a budget emergency and said we had to cut health spending and education spending to solve the budget emergency, after they couldn't get their health and education cuts through, went, oh, fuck it, let's cut taxes then. Right, now that's fine. That's fine, it's a democracy, they're allowed to do crazy stuff. But it's not an ideology. It's dead. They've abandoned it. So if they want to subsidise coal mines and you want to subsidise something else, great, agree with them that subsidies work. Disagree with them about what we want more of. Because if you want more coal mines, coal subsidies are a great idea. Right? But if you want more aged care or child care or dental care, well, subsidising that's a great idea. And that's just a democratic debate that we can all participate in. And you know what? I reckon in an election, in a choice between more coal mines or more dental care, I reckon we'll do all right. Now, this is important because it's not about economics and it's not about ideology. It's just actually about what kind of country we want to live in. And after 27 years, oh, that'll be my dinner. After 27 years of economic growth, we're told we're poor. Well, okay, so how many more years of economic growth do we need before we're rich? Because if neoliberalism's greatest strength was that it gave us 27 years of economic growth, then how come we can't afford to do stuff today that we could do 20 years ago? Right, exactly. It's not complicated, but they've made it seem complicated. That's their trick. That's what the neoliberalism was about. And when we rip that away, when we stop calling them neoliberal and just say they're people that like coal mines more than dentists, well, then we can have a public debate about what kind of country we want to have. So I don't want to speak for too much longer because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. But a couple of other points that I make in the essay that I think are quite important to understanding not just what neoliberalism is, but what neoliberalism's done. There's a great quote in the book, I think the most important quote in the book, is from Margaret Thatcher, who says, she talks about basically why she set out on the neoliberal agenda. She said economics is the method. The objective was people's hearts and their souls. Margaret Thatcher. She won. Like, give her credit. She changed not just England, she changed the world. Right? She was worried about the collectivist spirit that kind of haunted England in the 1970s and 80s, and she hated it, and she set out to change it, and she did. And she makes clear that economics, privatisation, deregulation, all that stuff, that was the method. Her goal was to change people's hearts and souls. And she did. And she didn't just make England a more individualistic country, she's made the Western world more individualistic. And that was the plan. Right? And again, it's a democracy. There's nothing in the Constitution about whether we should work together or we should stand alone. It's a democratic choice. But Margaret Thatcher set out to change people's hearts and souls. And in Australia today, well, let's go back. We used to think of ourselves as the land of the sickie and the smoko and the long weekend. Australia was once called the workers' paradise, and now we work some of the longest hours in the world. We treat our unemployed worse than most people in the developed world. And according to some research by my colleague Jim Stanford recently, more than half of people working in Australia don't have paid leave anymore. We've fundamentally changed our society through the pursuit of these neoliberal policies. But my point is they only pursued some policies that were neoliberal. Right? They hate subsidies for renewable energy. They love subsidies for private health insurance. Right? It's not complicated. They don't hate subsidies. They love subsidies for things they like, and they hate subsidies for things they hate. Not complicated. Neoliberalism has made us a more individualistic society. It's made individuals think that our retirement income is our own problem, that our health care is our own problem, indeed our unemployment is our own problem. I was unemployed when I finished uni in the early 90s. I didn't believe for a minute it was my fault. No, seriously, and no one told me it was my fault. There was a recession. There was fucking 11% unemployment. That's why I was unemployed. It was a macroeconomic failure. But these days we blame unemployed people for being unemployed. That's new. We didn't used to do that. The worst, or my favourite example, or the worst example in the book I use about this is the fact that the War Memorial in Canberra, built in 1941 during World War II, right? So perhaps we had a bit on at that point, all right? Some might say we were a bit busy, our finances were a bit stretched, but in 1941 we could afford to build a war memorial because we wanted to remember our dead. And the design ethos of the War Memorial is this beautiful big, the pool of reflection. Anyone who's been to the War Memorial? Right, the pool of reflection. 102,000 names of men and women who died fighting for Australia. All of their names are in brass, the same size font, no mention of rank, because the design ethos was that all men were equal in death. It did say all men, right? There are women on that board. General, private, same font, 102,000 names. All men are equal in death. Except, of course, these days, at the War Memorial, we have corporate sponsors. And their name is in much bigger font. Because even though we could afford to build a war memorial in 1941, apparently these days we can barely afford to maintain one without the generous support of weapons manufacturers. So in the war memorial now, indeed in the pool of reflection, thank you to the Australian Gas Association, because they installed the eternal flame, for which we thank them generously in a large plaque. And the gas industry generously give us the gas to burn in our eternal flame, lest we eternally be grateful for their sponsorship. I'm not making this up. Lest we forget our sponsors is now the ethos of our war memorial. Because neoliberalism has made us feel so poor that we think we can't afford to even maintain a war memorial. We thank BHP in a very large plaque in the entrance hall to the war memorial. The ATO is chasing BHP for more than $1 billion in unpaid taxes at the moment. If they paid their tax, we wouldn't need their sponsorship. but we thank them for their sponsorship, and they spend a fortune on accountants trying to not pay their tax. So neoliberalism has changed our society in important ways. And I argue in the book, A, that neoliberalism doesn't really exist anymore as an ideology. It has rhetorical power. I'm saying we have a right-wing government. The right haven't lost, but they've lost their biggest idea. They've abandoned it themselves. They've changed our society quite dramatically. Health is different, education's different, unemployment's different, our war memorial is different thanks to neoliberalism. But my conclusion in the essay is that the opposite to neoliberalism, indeed the opposite to kind of right-wing economics, I argue the opposite isn't left-wing economics. The opposite of right-wing economics is actually a vibrant democracy. Right? We don't need fancy economic policies to counter all this stuff. Subsidies work. We just can't agree what we want more of. Right? The right know that if you want more coal mines, you need to subsidise them. Well, we know if you want more health or education or aged care, we need to spend more on it. It's not complicated. What we need to do is replace a very narrow economic debate about tax cuts and IR reform. 30 years we've been talking about those issues, and we've used those issues to tell the rest of the public that we can't talk about anything else. Well, I argue in the essay that it's actually after 27 years of economic growth, it's actually time to start talking about everything else. It's time to start talking about what is the society we want more of, what we want less of, and who's going to pay for it and who's going to get it for free. And to be clear, there's no simple answers. We're going to disagree with each other about that. But settling those disagreements and setting those priorities is exactly what democracy, exactly what Parliament was set up to do. And all we need to do is start having those debates. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. And look, insofar as I agree with everything you've said, I guess all I can say to people is that they should definitely buy a copy of your essay, preferably
get one from a library.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Don't mess with my pitch. I was going to say every room in your house deserves one. But one of the things that was of interest to me, you said that, for example, that neoliberals don't have an ideology. In your essay, you bring up that sort of illustrative old quote from John Howard, to the effect that back in the days before he decided he really wanted to win an election, he compared Medicare to rape, I think it was, of low-income earners, which definitely shows the the standards of civility to which the guy lends himself, despite the fact that he likes to reinvent himself now as the grand old man of Australian politics back in the good old days when everybody was polite to one another and things like that. So I'm just asking, so I guess my question's more about sort of process and campaigning more than anything else. We spent a lot of time in the 80s, 90s and the 2000s arguing about abstractions. Arguing sort of, should things be regulated, should things be deregulated, as if there was some amazing sort of ideal state in which everything was deregulated and things like that. So to what extent should we really just ditch all of that stuff and really get down and dirty, as you say, and simply say, well, look, they don't have actually any rules, any logic that they respect in any of those arguments, so to what extent should we feel bound by any of their rules?
Great, thank you. Great question. Look, the only rules we should be bound by are those in the Constitution. I think laws and rules are really important, but we should completely reject the rules of public debate set up by our opponents. So to be clear, I don't think it's down and dirty or hypocritical or anything to say I think markets do a brilliant, fantastic job of setting up cafes and a shit job of running a health system. But they're just unrelated points. And we've kind of fallen into this very... And the neoliberals, the right of Australian politics, wanted us to have a fake ideological debate. Do you think we should trust individuals to make their own choices and trust free enterprise and individuals, or do you like red tape, nanny-statism and government collective control of everything? And it's a bizarre binary. Like, it's a demarcation that's meaningless. No one supports free trade. No one. No, I've never met a sane adult, no, literally, who supports free trade. Most people support restrictions on trade in guns. Most people support restrictions in trade on some drugs. Most people support restrictions in trade on body parts. Most people support restrictions in trade on humans. If you supported free trade, you wouldn't support any regulation on trade. Yet we've had a 30-year phony argument with effectively the drunk uncle at Christmas, you know, over a bizarre hypothetical illusion. Like, of course everybody wants to regulate trade, we're just haggling over what kind of regulations we like. And increasingly people think, yeah, let's regulate live animal exports more. And I don't think that's a terrible, terrible thing and contradictory. I think it's common sense. Right? The right of Australian politics are uptight about you know, they love restricting imports of drugs. Go ask the pharmaceutical industry whether they're okay with free trade in cheap pharmaceuticals from New Zealand to Australia. Because there's a lot cheaper pharmaceuticals in New Zealand than there are in Australia. Try putting a lot of them in a box and posting them to Australia, freely trading in pharmaceuticals, right? And the global companies that say they like free trade will take you to court, right? So no one supports free trade. No one thinks that governments should do everything or nothing. We just need to have an honest democratic fight about what kind of things we want to regulate and when and how, and what kind of things we think the government is better at doing and what kind of things we want to leave it to individuals to do. And even cafes aren't deregulated. There's all sorts of OH&S, safety and planning laws that restrict trade in cafes. And I've never met a cafe owner that thinks that coffee carts should be freely available around cities because they want to restrict competition. So we've just got to kind of abandon the idea that the right likes free trade and free markets, because they don't. They like some free trade in some things. All right, and even the regulation stuff. I mean, you know, John Howard's gift, Work Choices, to deregulate the labour market, what was it, 1,000 pages long? 1,000 pages of regulation? And we called it what? Deregulation? No, but seriously, like, don't take the bait. They never wanted to deregulate the labour market. They wanted to change the rules. Right? They wanted to change the rules, and they did. And we want to change the rules back. But they never wanted to deregulate. They never wanted to deregulate. They just wanted to regulate differently.
So I got involved with Australian Fabians because I was looking to come to a lot of events just like this, and because there is simply not a policy forum or an institute over here that's really based here. So if you are looking to get involved with the Fabians, come and hit me up and I'll sign you up, okay? Now my question to Richard is, we talk a lot about, in Australia, about the inequality within our borders, but I'm particularly activated by a sense of justice for other people outside of our borders in our region. Because you see so many people exploited, and we had some Indonesian unionists here recently talking about their exposure to asbestos. And I was wondering, from my perspective, is what can a new government do to properly craft a foreign policy and a trade policy that will ethically take care of some of the concerns within our region about the products made over there and how they come into Australia and if they're to standard, protect the workers over there by working with their governments, but also stopping the hollowing out particularly of our manufacturing industries here, by the undercutting of practices elsewhere in our region.
Yeah, look, thanks. What an important question. I don't write much about foreign policy in the essay, but I think it's safe to say that the sort of neoliberal version of foreign policy makes even less sense than their version of domestic policy. So in Australia, we're kind of told two stories simultaneously. On the one hand, only free markets and free enterprise and individualism can create prosperity. And thank God communist China's growing so fast. No, because that's our economic strategy, okay? As long as communist China keeps growing like no one ever anticipated, our prosperity's assured. So which is it, kids? Like, I'm confused. Because if communism, and of course China has a complicated version of communism, but you know, basically China ignored everything the IMF and the World Bank and Australian Treasury would have ever advised them to do if they were dumb enough to ask Australian Treasury for economic advice. No, I'm not kidding. Like, they basically ignored the neoliberal rule book. And no country has lifted more people out of poverty in world history than China in the last 30 years. Now, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of other problems in China, but the one thing you couldn't fault them on is their ability to transform an enormous agricultural economy into an enormous manufacturing economy. And they did it by ignoring neoliberalism, let's be clear. And domestically in Australia, again, 27 years of economic growth. Right, by all objective financial measures, we've never been richer. We're one of the richest countries in the world, living at the richest point in world history, and we've never spent a smaller proportion of our budget on aid than we do today. I mean, it's a disgrace. Anyone know how many people live in PNG? 3 million? 8 million. 8 million people live in Papua New Guinea, our northern neighbour. It is irrelevant to Australian politics. Right, it's the size of New South Wales. Right, the population of PNG is far bigger than the population of Western Australia. Our foreign policy doesn't make it to our nearest neighbour, how invisible the Pacific is. And of course, you know, Indonesia is further away but still close to us. We think about them about that much. You pick up a newspaper in Europe and you read all about what's happening in the region around you, for the simple reason that we do live in an interconnected world. So I don't think there's a short answer to your question, but the big picture answer is that plenty of other countries around the world have ignored neoliberalism and prospered. We, despite our wealth, have never been less generous to those with far less than us. Our foreign policy virtually ignores the hundreds of millions of people near us, including 8 million people in PNG. And in terms of manufacturing in Australia, well, we've told ourselves some simple lies for many years. But the main one is that if we don't cut taxes and we can't cut wages, if we don't cut taxes and we don't cut wages, we have no chance of exporting anything because everyone knows we can't compete with China. And I write about this in the essay. I sound like a wanker here, but you know, I'm an economist. I don't know what that means. Seriously, I don't know what can't compete means. I don't actually know what competitiveness means. And I write about that in the essay, but I swear I have no idea what it means, and I'd fail a student that tried to use that concept in an economics course. But we've been made to feel insecure. We've been made to feel uncompetitive, whatever that means. But let's just kind of ignore the theory for a second, just look at the data. If we don't cut wages and we don't cut taxes, we can't possibly make things and compete with China. And we know this is true because Northern Europe doesn't exist. Okay? There is no Northern Europe. There is no 100 million people living in higher wage, higher tax countries than us, making shit and selling it to China. Okay, has anyone here heard of Sweden? Anyone been? Yeah, I have. It's there. You can land a plane on it and everything. Anyone heard Anyone heard of Volvo? IKEA? You know what you can buy in China? Volvos and IKEA. It's more complicated, frankly, than we need to cut wages and we need to cut taxes. And you don't have to win a fight with the drunk uncle. Just say Volvo, you know, or IKEA, and let them explain how Sweden manages to do it. Because they won't be able to, because they're idiots.
Thanks, Louise, and particularly thank you, Richard, for coming all this way. It's particularly exciting to have you here in a small group. I'm also apologising for Sue Bowers. She can't be here tonight. She's our regional secretary. But I know we have quite a few CPSU members, federal public sector members here. And partly their interest has been piqued in the last 10 years or so because they are pretty much at the vanguard of some of the worst parts of the current government's neoliberal, dare I say it, policies, which is privatisation by stealth, defunding, not even being honest about doing that, just going straight to labour hire no matter the cost. So our members are getting it, are starting to really wake up to that. And 2/3 of our members are women, and on that I thought I'd ask you a sort of gender-related question. The measurement of GDP is always, I think, is highly selective of what's measured, sort of like the CPI index, and really hasn't been examined in terms of women's work, largely women's work, domestic work, I should say. And it's obviously mostly done by women. Marilyn Waring did some work in that space 20 years ago. Hasn't really been followed up. And I was wondering what happened to that area, because not only did she look at domestic work being measured properly, but also the environmental impact and the use of what comes as free in the environment. So is it because economists are mostly male and privileged, as per the Ross Gittins article this week, that we don't find those analyses going on?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, look, it's a really important point, and this month's monthly has a great essay called Gross Domestic Hoax, which has a good interview with Marilyn Waring in it. So, look, big picture, gross domestic product, GDP, most people have heard it, no one knows what it means. Gross domestic product refers to the total volume or total value of all the stuff that was bought and sold within our domestic borders last year. Gross domestic product, GDP. GDP, and by the way, sound like a wanker, but my last book was about all of this stuff, a book called Curing Affluenza. It's not a joke. So GDP, gross domestic product, was effectively invented during World War II. And it was very, 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 very useful after World War II for planning. There's a word that doesn't sound very economic, does it? Planning post-World War II reconstruction of Europe. Because if you'd kind of spent 5 years literally obliterating every building and road and piece of infrastructure across dozens of nation states, then I assure you that the data contained in gross domestic product was very handy in figuring out whether you were doing a good job of rapidly rebuilding entire countries. But the people who invented GDP, gross domestic product, right, World War II, were adamant that it would never and should never be used as a measure of progress. Gross domestic product is a measure of activity. It's a measure of a particular kind of activity, market sector activity. All right, so everything that's bought and sold in the legitimate economy is measured. We keep track of it every time your cash register rings up a sale. Everyone that pays tax, the data winds up in gross domestic product. And if you want to know exactly how much stuff got bought and sold last year, You got no problem with GDP. It's a fantastic indicator of how much stuff that got bought and sold last year. But that's just not a very interesting or important question. All right, and here's the thing. Don't blame economists or the people who invented it for the fact that idiots misuse it. All right, I'm not blaming you, all right, but I'm a bit worried about the person standing next to you, all right, because a lot of people have a tendency to use the number for something it was never intended to be used for. It is not a measure of progress. It's not. It's not a measure of all the production in a country. It's a measure of the market production in a country. And we could double GDP. We could double it pretty easily. I'm not kidding. We just have to do things like ban doing your own washing. Right? Because if we made it illegal to wash your own clothes, but it was okay for you to pay your neighbour to wash your clothes, and your neighbour could pay you to wash your clothes, GDP would go through the fucking roof. No, I'm not kidding. But it would. This is unarguable. This is true. It's also meaningless. And that's the point. So GDP is a great indicator of how much stuff got bought and sold last year. It's a great indicator of that. It's a very accurate indicator of something not very important. And we've turned it into something important. And we've said if GDP is going up, we must be getting better off. 27 years of GDP going up. But, and again, I wrote about this in Curing Affluenza, less so in this essay, but what matters is not the size of the economy, measured by GDP, but the shape. Because spending $1 billion to build a coal mine we don't need, versus spending $1 billion to subsidise dental care will both boost GDP. But one will make us a happier, healthier place and the other won't. Okay, there's all sorts of old jokes about GDP, like the more car crashes we have, the better it is for the economy. It's true. Right, if we went and just pour oil on all the road at all the intersections, we'll create lots of jobs. Please don't do this. This is a joke. No, I'm being recorded. I didn't encourage idiots to do stupid things. All right, but if we caused a lot of car crashes, we would create a lot of jobs in panel beating in hospitals, and no one thinks that that would make us a better place. Right? You know that. So if all GDP is add up the total amount of stuff that got bought and sold, and we don't talk about what stuff got bought and sold, then we're completely missing the point. So you're right, GDP is a terrible indicator of progress, but I can tell you on behalf of privileged male economists, we know. Right? We know. But 99% of politicians are not economists. Okay, and 99% of the public aren't economists. So why are non-economist politicians talking to non-economist publics using bizarre economic concepts that only we understand? And I would suggest it's quite deliberate. It's to keep you out of democratic debates. Right? It's not an accident. And trust me, I don't stand here in defence of my profession. It's appalling things have been said and done by economists, but never believe economists are running the country. No, they're not. Politicians are running the country, as they should. But economists get used as an excuse to do nasty shit. Right? It's not that the economics says you have to do nasty shit. It's that politicians would rather say, Richard made me do it. No, we're the cover story. Right? We're the cover story. We're just the excuse for this stuff. Right? It's not economists. Economists didn't make John Howard do what John Howard did. He found patsy economists to go out and explain why we had to do what he wanted us to do. Right? And that's what Margaret Thatcher did. And that's fine. They didn't break the rules. They won. But don't, blame economists for lots of things, but don't blame economists for powerful politicians pulling the wool over your eyes.
Richard, that's a good segue into my question, because you highlight in your essay some of the good areas where the Labor Party is making deliberate choices around public policy and choosing priorities. But I'm interested in whether you've got a critique of whether we are still preferencing neoliberal ideas and finding our patsy economists to help us justify particular agendas. I'm wondering if you've got a critique on that.
Yes and yes. Look, I think the Labor Party has really done quite a significant pivot in the last 5 years. That would be my observation. I remember in the lead up to the 2013 federal election, I debated John Brogden at the National Press Club. John Brogden was at the time the head of the Financial Services Council, the superannuation peak body, the for-profit superannuation peak body. And, you know, I was Lefty Australia Institute dude. And at the National Press Club in the lead up to the 2013 election, I was suggesting that tax concessions for superannuation were an outrageous rort, that they weren't taking pressure off the age pension, and that they had an appalling gender bias. They're terrible for women, terrible. I mean, you couldn't invent a scheme that does more to generate inequality in retirement than the superannuation system that we have, and that parts of Labor are still very proud of because the intent was good, rather than worried about because it's actually, I'd say, gone off the rails. So in lead up to the 2013 election, I was making a whole bunch of points about the inequality, the inequity and the unsustainability of the superannuation system. And John Brogden was saying they were perfect and we should keep it the way it is. And at the 2013 election, Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister again, second time round, and Tony Abbott was opposition leader. And in 2013, both of them were adamant that we shouldn't touch the superannuation system ever. Right, and Labor came up with some bullshit golden handcuffs, lock it in, everyone needs certainty, because like when you've won that much, the last thing you want to do is keep playing, yeah? So in 2013 there was bipartisan support for the assertion that tax concessions were fine, they were good, and we shouldn't touch them. And after the 2013 election, Labor actually changed their policy. And for the first time said, no, we've got to rein them in. And you know what the Libs did? Agreed. And when it went to the 2016 election with both parties promising different but new changes to reduce income tax inequality associated with superannuation. So in 2013, bipartisan consensus that everything was fine. 3 years later, bipartisan consensus that we needed to do something about it. Labor, I think, has done an admirable job of prosecuting the case to close a whole bunch of tax concessions and loopholes. And look, to be clear, the Greens have pushed for similar things for a long time. Some others, the Democrats, I was Natasha Stott Despoja's Chief of Staff, so that was all my fault. So some of these ideas have been around for a long time. But what we've now got is a potential government saying we're going to do something about this. Capital gains tax reform, negative gearing, tax concessions for superannuation, and obviously the franking credit stuff. Now, none of those are radical changes in and of themselves, but for someone who's been screaming into the wilderness for 20 years saying, for fuck's sake, collect some more revenue, it's pretty nice to see. And again, Labor went to the 2016 election and the press gallery were adamant that proposing to collect more tax would be the end of them. Really, that was the consensus opinion in the press gallery, that Shorten had really stuffed it up because he was going to collect more tax, spend more money and have a bigger budget deficit, and he nearly won one seat. And ever since the 2016 election, Labor's rolled out a broad range of revenue measures. And again, this is really important because the press gallery can't get their head around this. There's a difference between collecting more revenue and increasing my tax rate. They're entirely unrelated things. When you shut down a whole bunch of loopholes and remove a whole bunch of concessions, you collect a lot more revenue. And my tax rate and your tax rate are unchanged. So Labor's political strategy is, I think, you know, quite a simple economic strategy. They're doing what the right said they want. They're simplifying the tax system, simplifying it by getting rid of the loopholes and the exceptions. And in the meantime, that means they collect a lot more revenue, which allowed Shorten in his budget and reply speech to say 3 things that people thought were impossible. I want to spend more money. I want to cut your income taxes, and I want to reduce the budget deficit. And those 3 things are not complicated when you're raising tens of billions of dollars by closing loopholes that most people have no idea about, let alone access to. So yeah, I think we've seen Labor pivot quite substantially away from the idea that cutting taxes and cutting spending and cutting the budget deficit is the only way to get elected. I still see some of your colleagues, I won't name them here, looking a little nervous at this kind of left-wing heresy. No, well, it still is. Like, you know, there's a lot of people that have been around for a long time who believe that it's both good for the economy and good politics to just say cut spending, cut taxes. But what we're seeing in Australia and around the world is that actually go ask people, are they okay with closing tax loopholes? And the answer's a pretty resounding yes. So yeah, no, I still think there's some in your caucus that are kind of desperate to kind of hold true to the neoliberal sort of line, but I do hope they read my essay for the simple reason, no, because the right don't believe it. The right don't believe it. Okay, if the right really wanted to cut taxes more, they wouldn't waste money subsidising coal mines. Right? They could get rid of the dodgy subsidies. They could get rid of the subsidies to private health insurance and cut people's tax rates. The right don't believe it. So I hope not too many in your party still do, but we'll see.